and muscles. There's a little bit of joints, but especially thinking about joints is how they interact with muscles. And we're going to spend a lot of time on this first chapter, which is muscle tissues and muscle functions. So some very interesting things about exercise and how muscles work. A lot of things as we get going toward the end of that. We're going to spend 4 or 5 days just on this one chapter. There's a lot to cover on this one chapter, particularly on how muscles work. It takes a little bit of time to discuss that. We're going to start off that then with a bit of an overview of some of the terms for different portions of a skeletal muscle tissue. Before we get to think about how muscles work, we have to introduce the terms, the language, so we can communicate as we go through how muscles work. Again, what's on the board on the right, or the whiteboard on the right, has our schedule. Again, we're going to start out with mostly anatomy or organization of muscles today. And then next week, we'll come back with skeletal muscle contraction on both probably Monday and Wednesday. Your next quiz is next Wednesday. It'll be something about muscles. What exactly it's going to cover, I don't know. Probably it's going to be muscle tissue anatomy, muscle tissue organization, skeletal muscle tissue organization. And that's our plan for that one. Any other questions about the test or course or organization? Okay, we've got our movie question here starting off. Everybody, maybe many people probably recognize this one.
Conan.
Yeah, it's one of the Conan movies. I put Conan the Barbarian. I can't remember if that was actually that movie or not. Who, by the way, Arnold's supposed to be making another one, so I'm not sure if he can still do a Conan movie this late up in his 60s. We'll have to see.
Maybe it'll be a very aged Conan.
Yeah. Well, Robert Howard's original stories feature Conan anywhere from a boy of about 15 or 16 all the way up to an aged king up in his 50s or 60s. So they could certainly, and some of his stories are just brilliant. If they can get the story right, then they can probably come up with a good movie. The key is getting the story right, which was a disaster in the last one.
I never realized there were movies made in the 60s.
Those are actually books written in the 60s. So the original stories were written by a guy named Robert Howard back in the 30s. You probably heard him mentioned a couple times on Big Bang Theory. You know, the guys mentioned Robert Howard stories. But anyway,
check those out.
He did not become very famous, the character Conan, until really the 60s or 70s when an artist named Frank Frazetta started painting covers for those particular books. Basically, you can see, in fact, maybe it's not dark enough here, but you see that this particular whole costume was modeled in part off of this particular painting. Frank Frazetta died just a year or two ago, so that's pretty recent. And the reason kind of why I brought this up is Frank Frazetta actually got his start in an A&P class. He originally was a student, I think, interested somewhat in medical biology, and as part of his study methods, he would try to draw various anatomical features. And he particularly liked muscles and form and posing people in different kind of positions and skeletal structures. And his teacher noticed he was actually making, in his study diagrams, was actually making diagrams better than what the artwork was in the textbooks, and directed him on to an art career. And so he gradually started moving into art things. He also painted a lot of the Tarzan covers for some of the old Tarzan books back in the 60s and 70s. And one of our colleagues here, getting off track here just a little bit, Dr. O'Keefe, he had a professor that collected Tarzan paintings by this guy Frank Frazetta. And I said to him very naively, we ought to hang on to those things, might be worth something someday. And he sort of blinked and looked at me, yeah, they're worth about $200,000 each. Frank Frazetta has not sold very much of his paintings. All his family finally broke down and sold one of his paintings just last year, and I think it went for $3 million or something like that. So that's a pretty good ending after. And he's got a lot of paintings that will go for $5 to $10 million, the original oil paintings. And that's a pretty good ending for someone who started out in anatomy physiology. So you never know what kind of career this might lead to. Anyway, moving off from that was my story here about why we put that in there. We're going to mainly talk about skeletal muscle tissue in this chapter. We'll do a little bit about smooth muscle, and we'll do a little, but not much at all about cardiac. That's really going to be covered when we get to the heart in the second semester. let's see here. Let's start out making a clicker question, and can you tell me which of these are striated? If there's more than one, just pick one of them. So just to review first of all these different kind of tissues, we're mainly are interested in skeletal. The bulk of our time is going to be with skeletal muscle tissues, a little bit with smooth, practically none in cardiac because that's going to be covered with the heart later on. Okay, you guys picked on this. Did you pick either, if you picked either A or C, you would be correct. Both of those are striated. Smooth muscle is not striated. We're going to learn why those striations exist here in just a little bit. Multinucleate. Only one of those is multinucleate. Let's see if you can pick out or remember which one of those are multinucleate. That is, there's more than one nucleus per cell. Which, by the way, while I'm thinking about this and you're thinking, a muscle cell is also called a muscle fiber. That can be a little bit confusing or unfamiliar the first time that you've heard it. But another term, and the more common term for a muscle cell, is called a muscle fiber. Maybe because they're a very unique organization. Okay, which one is multinucleate? You guys picked on this one. You picked a lot of A and C. If you picked A, you would be correct on this one. Skeletal muscle is inherently very multinucleate. C is not a terrible choice because very rarely there's more than one nucleus in a cardiac, but that would be a pretty rare case. But certainly in skeletal, that would be the place where that occurs. Where we have these different kinds of muscle tissues, remember that skeletal muscle is voluntary. It's what makes up body muscles. It's the one that we can consciously control. It helps to move the body in various planes. Smooth muscle forms components of visceral organs, part of the digestive system, part of blood vessels, part of urinary organs, reproductive organs, respiratory organs, a lot of viscera, and of course cardiac is restricted to the heart. Again, we're going to mainly focus on that A, the skeletal muscle. We'll learn why they're striated. We'll learn why or how they get to be multinucleate. We'll do all that over the next couple of slides. So that's just a quick overview, a reminder of what we kind of already remember or knew from skeletal muscle tissue. So we're going to focus on that one right there. Let's take a look at what we call the macroorganization of a single muscle. So maybe a muscle, we've got a biceps brachii muscle, or maybe one in the forearm, a supinator muscle, whatever we have here. What we have here in the green are different connective tissues. All of these green terms refer to different layers, different kinds of connective tissue associated with muscles, and they help to subdivide it into different units. Let's start with the smallest, first of all, endomysium. This is a thin connective tissue layer around an individual muscle cell, individual muscle fiber. This is not the plasma membrane. This is not that membrane. It actually is a connective tissue band around that cell, around that muscle fiber. So and it's called the endomysium. Think of endo as inside. It's the deepest. So endomysium, it's a connective tissue layer surrounding a single muscle fiber. Perimysium, peri means surrounding, and that surrounds a fascicle. So what is a fascicle? What do we mean by that? Let's imagine just for a moment, we're looking at a cross-section of a muscle. Looks like a fiber optics cable. And these little white circles I've drawn are the cross-sections through the cells. Those are the cells. Surrounding each one of those cells, in yellow here, is an endomysium. Are you guys doing this as you're studying? Are you using a lot of writing this part? You're studying making pictures of this, so instead of just looking at the slides, you're actually making pictures? I don't think a lot of you took advantage of the bones either that were in the lab. A few of you did, but not a lot did. I'm not sure actually how you learned the bones if you didn't go in there in the lab and look at them. That'd be very difficult to do. If you're able to do it without going and looking at the bones, I'm kind of impressed actually. That's hard to do. So around this clump of muscle fibers, which we call collectively a fascicle, this is surrounding a fascicle, this is the perimysium. This is the connective tissue around that. It's a pretty tough connective tissue. It's what's responsible for making the grain of meat. Meat is muscle tissue. So if you've kind of shredded apart a piece of pork or beef or maybe chicken, and you kind of see it's a bit stringy or there are grains associated with it, so to speak, what you're looking at, each one of those long grain-like things, is a fascicle. And it's composed of several muscle fibers, all surrounded by a bit of connective tissue. I think it's mostly a real or loose connective tissue, but there may be some variation. Some of it may be more of a dense or irregular as well. And then finally, around the entire muscle is the epimysium. That's the connective tissue that surrounds an entire muscle.
So all of these are connective tissue?
Everything in green here is connective tissues. They're not muscles themselves, but they help to organize the muscles into different units. Finally, one more thing is fascia. Fascia is connective tissue that often clumps several muscles together. Or it's additional connective tissue on the outside, further outside of epimysium. Some of you might have had the good fortune to be able to dissect maybe a cat in high school, or maybe a fetal pig or a frog or something like that. And you got to study muscles. And one of the things you probably noticed as you opened up that animal, you can't see any muscles. It doesn't look like the picture in the book, or it doesn't look like any muscles. All you see is this big reddish mass, maybe where the muscles would be. And to actually separate, to figure out individual muscles, you have to remove this thin connective tissue, this whitish material that's covering everything like a bit of plastic. It's called fascia, and you have to remove that to see any muscles. And that's additional connective tissue that's further superficial yet. Okay, moving on from that. Any questions?
So is the fascia outside of the epimysium?
Yes, it's further outside of that. It often binds several muscle groups together. So, for example, in your thigh area where the quadricep muscles are, you have a number of individual muscles. Each one of them is surrounded by epimysium. There's also, just when you say would open up, say with a human cadaver or a cat or any of the dissection animal, you take off the skin, you can't see the muscles. There's just this big whitish material like a sheath over everything. It's called fascia, and you have to remove that first. It's just another layer. Fascia is generally loose connective tissue. It's irregular, it's adipose, sometimes dense or irregular on some of the more dense portions of it. Let's talk about blood supply and nerves just for a minute. It's going to be important for muscles to function, to have good blood supply, so they have arteries and veins associated with them. And they also have nerves associated with them. We're going to talk about all of these over the whole course of the chapter. And let's think about what some of these different things do. So axons are part of motor neurons. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. That's part of the nervous system, obviously. Let's have some clicker questions here. So let's start out with that first thing, axons of motor neurons. It's in green. They function to what? Your choices are A, B, and C there. Carry blood away from a muscle, carry blood to muscle, signal muscle to contract. I bet most of us can get this one, even though we haven't really talked about blood vascular systems or nervous systems yet. We could probably figure this one out.
We talked about nervous systems and psych and
You may have had it in another course, you may have had it in high school. Well, I know my kids tell me they've had all this in high school before. My wife gave well, I won't tell that story. Well, yeah, I will. My wife's teaching a Biology 105 class, and so she gave it to to our daughter, who's in the 9th grade right now, and her daughter scored like an 88% on it without studying. She said, "Yeah, we've been studying about that the last couple of years." Anyway, moving off from that. Let's see something happened there. Why did I not see it? There it goes. Just a little bit slow. Yes, C is correct answer. They signal muscle contract. We're going to talk about motor units here in just a minute, and these neurons with their axons is what's going to trigger that muscle to contract. That's what's going to control contraction. If they send a signal, the muscle contracts. Arteries versus veins. Which one does what? Okay, let's review on this one just right quick here. And again, we've got a clicker question. Let's do arteries first. Arteries function too. Just two choices left here. Do they carry blood to the muscle, or do they carry blood away from the muscle? Okay, I don't expect everybody to get this because we haven't talked about blood vessels yet, but this is a good way of understanding how muscles work. We're eventually going to talk about exercise and energy supply to muscles and fast twitch and slow twitch fibers and why marathon runners look different from sprinters and so on.
Can I ask a question before I answer?
Sure.
If you puncture an artery, will it bleed red or blue?
Red would be yes for both, but the color of red is
Bright
usually
red.
very crimson in arteries.
Okay, that's all I want.
It's more like a darker red in veins for the most part. Okay, let's see if that helped a little bit. Maybe change some answers. Let's see, artery functions too.
Yay.
Looks like you picked a lot of B. They carry blood to a muscle. B is correct on this one. So arteries carry oxygen-rich blood to muscles. Veins are going to carry then the oxygen-poor blood away from muscles. Muscles tend to have pretty good blood supply. Skeletal muscles blood supply. When skeletal muscles are active, they consume a lot of oxygen. They consume a lot of ATP energy. And again, we'll talk about that idea of exercise in muscles. That's several things on down the line, but we will get to that in this chapter. Probably not till the end of next week, middle or end of next week. Let's talk about this idea of a motor unit just for a minute. It's related to how nerves are associated with muscles. And I need to make a diagram here of a motor unit. What is a motor unit? Well, first of all, here's my diagram. Okay, here's a brain, not part of our motor unit yet. And here's a spinal cord coming down from our brain. So this is spinal cord. And now I'm going to draw a single motor neuron. By motor neuron, a motor neuron is one that controls a muscle. And here it is. We're going to draw it. Here's the cell body of it right here with the nucleus is down in this area. And it's got this long branch called an axon. So here's our axon of a motor neuron. We used this phrase already. And it's going to go out to some muscle fibers. I've got a piece of red chalk. Let's make some muscle fibers. That is muscle cells. There's one, there's two, and there's three. Maybe it branches at the end. Those are some muscle fibers. We're going to call these muscle fibers. This is a motor unit. A motor unit consists of a neuron, a motor neuron, and all of the fibers that it controls. It'll control those particular fibers, and it controls them in all or none fashion. When that motor neuron sends a message and fires, it causes all three of those to contract at once. It cannot contract just one of them. It contracts all three or it does none. The motor unit doesn't have to have just three. Here's another motor unit. Let's imagine another one. Here's another one right here, and our neuron, and maybe this time we've got 4 fibers. It might be in the same muscle. Maybe some motor units in the muscle have a lot of fibers per motor unit. In some cases it might have 1,000 or 10,000 fibers per motor unit. Some muscles have motor units that have relatively few fibers. Some muscles have motor units that have a lot of fibers. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. And that's what my next topic is, thinking about how function is related to anatomy. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare two situations. Here's a motor unit with few fibers per motor unit. And here's a comparative different muscle with lots of fibers. Per motor unit. We're going to compare these. Well, first of all, let's pick out, let's say, what is our total fibers? Two different muscles. We're going to make them the same initially as having the same total number of fibers in the muscle. So two muscles, they've got 10,000 fibers each, they're just as strong. The more fibers you have, the stronger the muscle is. So no difference there. Fibers per unit. How are these arranged? So in this case, we're going to have one of our situations, this one with few fibers per motor unit, it's going to have just 10 fibers per motor unit. So when it contracts, it can contract 10 or 20 or 40 or 670 or 680 or 690. It can contract its fibers in a unit of 10. The other one, the units are in the motor units are in units of 1,000. It cannot contract just 10. It can only do 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, or so on. What would be an advantage of having this particular scenario where you have relatively few fibers per motor unit? Josh?
I imagine it would be more articulate, like being able to control, more at the same time individually.
That's exactly right. You're probably looking for a word like maybe good precision, very precise control of the muscle. Because you can have very narrow gradations of how strongly you contract that.
I imagine the tongue would be...
That is exactly one case where that occurs. I'm not sure who said that. Kelsey in the back there. Yes. So particular muscles that have this might be things that control voice, that control our eyes by looking one direction or the other. Muscles that control finger manipulation, for example, dexterous. Muscles that say would control lip motions, lip directions for speaking, for enunciating words. We tend to have very small motor units for those. Is there a benefit for having motor units having large numbers of fibers?
It'd be stronger muscles.
They are characteristic of stronger muscles. They don't inherently make the muscle stronger, because in these two situations they still have the same number of fibers, so the total strength of contraction would be the same in these two.
Well,
Be like
if you're thinking about in terms of your heart, like a big portion of your heart has to beat at a certain time, doesn't it? So isn't it to like move one muscle at a time?
It does move that to a certain degree. You're kind of going in the right direction.
Muscles use more.
Well, when it's a very large muscle, you're going to have to organize them like this. There's a reason for this. Think about the total number of motor units. The total number of motor units. How many would there be in this case? If there are 10,000 fibers and they're arranged in units of 10, the total number of motor units would be 10,000 divided by 10 would be 1,000. So we have a total of 1,000 motor units and 1,000 neurons to control that whole muscle. In this one, we just need 10 motor units and 10 neurons.
Is it for faster movement, maybe?
Not faster exactly.
Imagine it would be like a muscle that only has like one use, like the bicep, where all it does is contract.
That's exactly the kind that we do. Is the ones that are like this would be muscles, say, in arm region or particularly thigh, leg region. They're very massive. You don't need a lot of precise control. This is a way of controlling that muscle using only a small amount of neurons. Neurons take up space.
Okay.
This provides economy of neurons in space. As it is right now, the sciatic nerve, the largest nerve in your body that controls most of your thigh and leg, is about 1 inch in diameter. So it's pretty big. It's made up of motor neurons that are like this. If we gave very precise control, and there's no reason to give precise control for something in the thigh or leg, you might end up with a nerve coming down your leg this big around, the size of a basketball. We want to have very precise control. There's not space for that, and the neurons take up a lot of energy. Just maintaining neurons is very energy expensive. Any questions? We'll stop there for today.